Hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Atkins, Van Otterloo Weatherby Director of the Center for Netherlandish Art, the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this first session of Art Museums and the Legacies of the Dutch Slave Trade, Curating Histories, Envisioning Futures. This four-part program is presented by the Center for Netherlandish Art at the MFA, the Harvard Art Museums, and Harvard University's Department of History of Art and Architecture. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Harvard University, the Harvard Art Museums, and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston are situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people. We collectively recognize the long history of the land our institutions occupy today, and we strive to honor this relationship and to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. The Center for Netherlandish Art is a public-facing research institute dedicated to the study of Dutch and Flemish art, especially of the 17th century. We opened our physical spaces this fall in Boston, but today's program, in advance of that launch, is the type of collaborative, multidisciplinary, and rigorous dialogue between past and present that is indicative of the CNA's future programming and our commitment to the issues raised by the symposium. The subject of our symposium is important and urgent. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many others, and the renewed calls for social justice that have followed, have thrown a blinding light onto the long and enduring legacies of slavery around the world. In the United States, slavery was on the land we occupy. It is baked into the fabric of our economy and cultures. For the Netherlands, slavery occurred first in territories they controlled through a vast maritime network. The system of slavery was disseminated, controlled, and promoted from the Netherlands. But the majority of enslaved people lived at a tremendous physical distance from the rest of the Dutch populace. The slave trade and enslaved people did much to fuel the economic explosion of the 17th century in the Netherlands. Though the operations were different, slavery is likewise integral to Dutch history and culture. We must examine these histories, our histories, and acknowledge the ongoing legacies of them. This is a pressing issue for art museums, and I want to stress that this symposium focuses on art museums, one among many types of institutions that are in the process of evaluation, reflection, and perhaps even reinvention. Art museums are increasingly places not just for collection and presentation, but for interpretation. Art museums are places to connect objects, narratives, histories, and audiences. The art in our collections, Dutch and others, were created in a culture with myriad systems that supported and enabled, if not outright promoted, slavery. Museums and their collections are also frequently embroiled with histories of slavery. How then do art museums tell these histories? How do we display and interpret these objects in our care for audiences today and the future? How can we learn from each other to create a pathway forward that more appropriately acknowledges and interrogates the cultures and contexts in which these objects were created? This symposium is a dialogue, an opportunity and an invitation to listen, to learn, to discuss, to chart pathways forward. The program that follows is the product of a fruitful multi-directional dialogue between the hosting partners, and I thank the staffs of all three institutions who worked to make today possible. This is a great example of how working together, universities and museums can co-create rich and rewarding results. And of course, I'm very pleased to acknowledge the three doctoral students in Harvard's Department of History of Art and Architecture and the Harvard Art Museum's postdoctoral fellow who thoughtfully and creatively initiated and organized this program. Sarah Mallory, Keela Jackson, Rachel Burke, and Joanna Seidenstein. And for supporting student research that informed this undertaking, we are grateful to the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, a university-wide effort housed at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. That the symposium began as a student and postdoctoral initiative is important. While providing platforms for emerging voices, we can learn much from the questions posed by students and early career professionals. Their perspectives and concerns bring new questions to the fore and force us to rethink answers to old ones. It is now my pleasure to turn the virtual floor over to Sarah Mallory.
Thank you, Chris, for your support throughout the planning of this series. And on behalf of my co-organizers, I also want to offer special thanks to Susan Anderson, Mariah Speck, and especially Erica Lawton for their essential contributions. While words could never possibly express the overwhelming and so often isolating experiences that have transpired since last March, today our paths now cross in pursuit of a shared history, that of the legacy of the Dutch slave trade. vast and touching so many corners of the earth, so deeply enmeshed with the histories of nations and peoples around the world. A history that, despite its vastness, is often pushed to the margins of art museums, though so many museum collections are themselves in some way a product of the slave trade. But this history is neither marginal and nor does it remain in the past. Rather, it permeates the present through the objects preserved by museums, presenting such institutions with the tremendous possibility to interpret slavery's legacy and legacies in a way that open pathways to a more liberated future. So it's in this spirit of possibilities and community that we begin today's gathering. Our hope is that this will be a space for reflection, dialogue, and inspiration, a place where the past and the present provide possibilities for envisioning futures. In planning this series, we hope to use the online format to construct an intentional virtual museum of sorts, a place full of objects dedicated to telling the story of the Dutch slave trade's legacies across the Atlantic. This story, a central component of a shared world heritage that has shaped every facet of modern life. We asked ourselves, what would such a museum be comprised of? What sorts of stories would it tell? How would it interpret the past and the present using artworks? And what sorts of futures would or could a study of the Dutch slave trade help us imagine? How can art museums bring forth both the cruel historical realities of the slave trade, as well as shine a light on the victories, creativity, cultural expression, and power of enslaved and formerly enslaved peoples? How can we make room to know and honor their deeply formative and enduring contributions to culture? In bringing a study of the Dutch slave trade's legacies to the fore, we hope to also understand the terms and conditions of social injustices that remain very much present and pronounced in our daily lives. We want to think specifically about how art and art museums can help build a more equitable society. Among our guiding questions are, how does the art we see impact the future we create? Can or should art be an apology, a tool for reparative justice? How can art museums and a study of art and the legacies of the Dutch slave trade support social justice? Today, and over the course of the next 2 Fridays, we will convene a total of 4 sessions dedicated to these questions. Now, for those who are interested, we have dropped registration links in the chat for the 3 upcoming events. Today's session is entitled Exhibiting Slavery and Representing Black Lives. Our 4 distinguished speakers have done work that represents some of the most exciting explorations of the legacy of slavery in museums and beyond. In this history, they are finding possibilities and forging pathways to new futures. We are extremely honored to welcome them here today, as we are all of you for taking time out of your schedule to join us. So before we begin, some logistics regarding today's program. We are using the webinar format in Zoom, so you'll notice that your microphones are muted and your videos are off. But we do very much welcome your participation via the question and answer box, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen. We will dedicate the last 15 to 20 minutes of the session to questions for all 4 of our presenters, though you can enter your questions into the Q&A box at any time. If your question is for a specific speaker, please indicate that. And just to note that your questions will remain invisible to other participants until they are answered. Since we have such a large audience, it is possible we won't be able to address every question, though we will do our best to do so. And we're going to conclude around 3 p.m. Eastern Time. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Maria Holtrop. Maria has been a curator of history at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam since 2013. She is one of the curators of the current exhibition of the upcoming exhibition, Slavery and Rijksmuseum and Slavery. And she also worked on the 2017 show, Good Hope, South Africa and the Netherlands since 1600, and was co-editor of a volume by the same title. We're so honored to welcome you here today. Take the floor, Maria.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm very honored to be asked to speak today, and I'm starstruck by the other speakers. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Holtrop. I'm a curator of history at the Rijksmuseum. And this photo that you see was taken a couple of days ago by Stephanie Archangel, my colleague, and one of the other speakers today. It is the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And on the poster, it says slavery, Rijksmuseum, and expected. As in many other parts of the world, we are waiting for the museums to open so that the exhibition on slavery that we worked on for the past 4 years can finally be seen by the public. Today, I will tell you about this exhibition and what it makes it different from other exhibitions in the Rijksmuseum. In February 2017, Taco Dibbits, our director, was interviewed in the Dutch newspaper De Volkskrant. Taco, as the new main director, was asked about his new plans for the museum and announced that the Rijksmuseum was going to make an exhibition on slavery. The headline says, "New director breaks with the past and makes an exhibition about slavery." And in it, he was quoted. He says, "The collection of the Rijksmuseum tells the history of the Netherlands that is connected to many countries. In good and less good ways, it is part of our history and should all be shown." The article generated a lot of reactions, people offering advice, knowledge, objects, etc. And it marked the beginning of 4 years of intense preparations and close contact with people from outside of the museum. Sometimes it felt as if we had an advisory board of 70 million Dutch people. But this exchange with our public, sometimes future public, contributed in many ways to the exhibition. Let me introduce you to the team. On the left, you see our team of curators. From left to right, we see Valika Smulders, head of the history department, then me, then Stephanie Archangel, and then Evelien Sint-Nicolaas, who headed our team. We all have different backgrounds: history, museology, heritage studies, sociology, journalism, and we have links in with Curaçao and Suriname. Our diverse background made us aware of our blind spots, which made it all the more important to also invite a think tank to help us. You see them on the right. They are academics, activists, young, less young, men and women, experts in transatlantic slavery and slavery in the Indian Ocean region. We had 5 valuable meetings with the group that helped us form our ideas and see the weak spots in our plans. And then on the bottom left, architect Afaya de Jong, she was asked to make the design. She immediately understood the impact of the building and our struggle with the lack of objects. So her design is an important part of this exhibition. And then finally, on the right, Jurgen Chonafung, who is a theater maker who helped us with the storyline and the audio tour. Let me now tell you about the setup for the exhibition. This exhibition is not a historical overview of the history of slavery with years and numbers, nor does it offer a complete overview of slavery from the Romans to modern slavery. Our focus is on the Dutch colonial period, from the 17th century to the 19th century. At the time, the Netherlands was active in the slave trade and slavery in the transatlantic region, where the Dutch West India Company was active, and around the Indian Ocean, where the Dutch East India Company was active. In this exhibition, we will combine these two parts of the history. Thirdly, we will focus on the Netherlands itself and show the traces and effects slavery had there. What is central are the people who were part of this history. We will tell 10 stories of people who related to the largest system of power and money in all kinds of ways, who were part of it or suffered under it, people who had to adapt to it or who dared to rebel against it, people in slavery and slave owners. By zooming in on these 10 personal stories, we want to look at what impact the system of slavery had on the lives of these individuals. I will take you through the exhibition. We start with a number of introductory rooms that focus on the system of colonial slavery and the sources available to us. In the atrium that you see on the left, bells from all over the world are on display. They come from Indonesia, Guyana, Suriname, Curaçao, South Africa, and were used on plantations to indicate the rhythm of the working day. The sound of the bells carried far and was a practical way to reach many people over a longer distance. But for people in slavery, the sound became associated with violence, with punishment. At the end of each day, it was determined whether enough had been harvested, and if not, punishment was harsh. This shows how there are many perspectives to this history and also to the objects associated with this history. When you enter the first gallery, You will hear and see 3 texts of songs that originated in slavery and tell us about the experience of slavery. They are from Curaçao, Suriname, and South Africa. These songs sing about the pain of parents who couldn't protect their children, of families being ripped apart, and the feeling to be seen as no more than a tool. The songs tell us more about the lives of the enslaved than the golden box in the middle that was presented to Stadtholder William IV when he became commander-in-chief of the Dutch West India Company, which is on view in the next gallery. For us, these songs are more than just songs. They are archival sources that give us historical information. By starting this exhibition with these three songs, we make a statement that in order to tell the stories of the enslaved, we need to complement our material collection with oral sources. In the next gallery, you will see the installation by the Beninese artist Rembrandthuis Museum, Labouche du Roi. It is a loan from the British Museum. Labouche du Roi is about the hardship of the journey across the ocean, densely packed as cargo in the hold of a ship, leaving family, culture, and language behind on the way to an unknown place in life. Hazume collected 304 petrol cans, which young men in Benin used for the illegal and hazardous transport of gasoline. The men heat the cans until they almost burst to increase their capacity, so that they hold as much petrol as possible, just as people in slavery were exploited to the extreme and then replaced by someone new. Each petrol can is a mask with unique features and represents a human being with a name, a voice, a culture. There are smaller masks for the women and children, and broken ones for those who died along the way. Sounds and smells also have an important part in this installation, and there's a video that shows the effect of this history on present-day Benin, of the people that were left behind. The last of the 4 introductory galleries is about what happened to the men, women, and children who survived this crossing. They were sold on arrival and they were called new names such as Lucky or Fortune. Enslaved people traded within the transatlantic region were not only called a new name, but also branded multiple times. In this way, it was made horrifyingly clear to people in slavery that from now on, they were quote unquote owned by someone else. They were made into an object. After these 4 introductory galleries, we introduced the visitor to the first of 10 historical individuals that were part of the slavery system. Sorry. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss all 10 stories in detail, but here you see our 10 names. The first 5 stories focus on living within the system of slavery. João is an enslaved African man in Brazil. Wally is born into slavery in Suriname. Paulus is an African servant in the Netherlands. Opien profited from slavery and she was portraited by Rembrandt. Van Bengalen are the enslaved people who were shipped from the Bay of Bengal in northeast India by the Dutch East India Company to Batavia, the Banda Islands, the Cape in South Africa, and Dokkum, the Netherlands. The second 5 stories are about fighting the system and striving for freedom and equal treatment. Surapati, now Indonesia's national hero, was an enslaved servant in Batavia who fought against the Dutch East India Company and became a ruler of her kingdom and Java. Sapali, a maroon woman in Suriname, hid unpeeled rice in her hair as a survival strategy. Tula, on Curaçao, aimed to change the colonial system from within. Dirk was a Dutch abolitionist who owned enslaved people himself. And finally, a female freedom fighter from Sint Maarten, Loke. It was quite a puzzle to come to these 10. We looked for a balance in geographical location, gender, and enslaved people, as well as people who profited from the system. It probably won't surprise you that this exhibition is very different than other exhibitions that are held in the Rijksmuseum. In the next slides, I will give you a couple of examples of this difference, such as objects, design, and ending. When making an exhibition on slavery, objects that tell the story of enslaved people are difficult to find. Enslaved people were not allowed to own things, so no objects that belonged to them were saved. And the objects that can tell the history of slavery are likely to be tainted by colonialism. So how do you do justice to the lives of the enslaved people through objects? This is what we have struggled with a lot. We have found this tronco on the upper left, a footstock. Several people could be constrained in footstocks like these as punishment. Their ankles were clamped in a block to prevent them from fleeing. In Brazil, the same kind of stocks can be found on former plantations. However, this one was found in the province of Zeeland in the Netherlands. Such stocks were made in the Dutch Republic and transported by ship to the colony. The work on the plantation is reflected through the kappa on the bottom left, a large iron kettle in which the sugar cane juice was further distilled. This object and the tronco were both donated to us for the exhibition. In the middle, you see sapali rice, a type only found in West Africa and Suriname. Rice was not only smuggled from the plantation to freedom, but already before that across the Atlantic Ocean. Genetically, this stock stems directly from the grains that Sapali, one of our 10 individuals, wove into her hair. We've also found objects that reflect intangible cultural knowledge of medicinal plants or musical instruments, such as the mouth bow. In the story of Surapati, we can show the Javanese perspective on his story through 18th century Javanese books called babats here on the lower corner right. A more problematic object are the archival documents. There are many documents that give glimpses of the lives of enslaved people and can tell us something about the hardships they encountered. Sometimes an enslaved person is even quoted, like in this interrogation of the enslaved Wally, one of the 10 stories. But we should never lose out of sight that those quotes have been written down by white colonial, mostly men, with their own specific perspective. To get closer to the experience someone in slavery must have had, we therefore also use oral sources, such as songs or interviews. This way we can come closer to the experience of slavery. A woman who was born in slavery and tells about her grandmother who was also enslaved gives us a direct link in an interview to the experience of slavery. And also the songs that I mentioned before tell us about the pain, despair, and worry people in slavery must have felt. These oral sources made it necessary for us a mandatory audio tour, or an audio tour that's mandatory for the public. Glenn Helberg, a psychiatrist who specializes in transcultural therapy, takes the visitor through the exhibition. Each of the 10 stories is told by a different narrator. They are people that feel connected to the historical individual because of their name, roots, or family history. These 10 narrators make it clear to the visitor that the history of slavery is not only something of the past, but continues into the present, and that the history of slavery is a history of all of us. In this exhibition, the design plays an important role. During one of the meetings with the think tank, the Rijksmuseum was called a temple of colonial self-aggrandizement. And architect Afijn de Jong described the building as the physical representation of the national Dutch identity. In a museum that is housed in a 19th century building that screams nationalism, you cannot organize an exhibition on slavery without acknowledging that building. This acknowledgement is reflected in the Jong's exhibition design, such as the application of color on some wall sections, while other sections are deliberately left white, as a reference to the Rijksmuseum as an institution. Through materiality and scale, the design also refers to the role of architecture in the slavery system, the difference in space between rooms for slaveholders and for enslaved people. In the first galleries, the visitor feels the oppressiveness of a dungeon or a ship's hold, and the design has a very directional quality. In the later galleries, the round shapes provide more opportunity to find one's own way and give therefore a greater sense of freedom. In the exhibition design, Afijn makes use of a lot of mirrors. The mirrors influence what the visitor does or does not see, and are an allusion to the invisibility of slavery in people's perceptions, both then and now. On the reverse of the reflecting walls, we find the stories that remained unheard for so long. It was important for us To have a place at the end of the exhibition where visitors could do something with the probably hard emotional experience they went through in the exhibition. To not just say to them, thank you, goodbye, but let them have the final word. That is why we end the exhibition with Look at Me Now, a cooperation with artists Tirso Marta and David Bade of Instituto Buena Vista from Curaçao. Visitors are invited to work with them on 10 new artworks based on the 10 stories from the exhibition. To have this exhibition be finally ready for the public makes it seem it was always there, but that's not the case at all. For the last 4 years, we have spent most of the time trying to find a way to do justice to this history while using structures that aren't designed to do this history justice. For days and days, weeks and weeks, months and months, years and years, we've talked, discussed, and argued about stretching up the limits of an exhibition and what it can show. And then there was the question of how we could make this project durable. We didn't want everything to go back to normal after we closed the exhibition. During the making of this exhibition, we have tried to be as transparent as possible and take as many people as possible with us in the process. We were followed by a documentary crew. We had talks and discussions with people from outside the museum, but also with our traditional stakeholders, for example, the friends of the museum. In a couple of well-attended meetings, we could explain them things as why an exhibition on slavery was necessary and the importance of terminology or different perspectives. We made video clips for our colleagues to tell them about our exhibition and tested out our plans with our colleagues in test panels. But then there was our permanent display in the main building, where not a lot of attention is given to slavery. As a first step, we decided to research the objects in our main building and see what invisible or visible links there were with slavery. This resulted in 78 new labels that are hung next to the regular ones for a year, as you can see in the picture on the upper right corner. The white ones are the new ones and the dark gray ones are the old ones. The new labels will show the ways people in the Netherlands profited from slavery or were connected to slavery, or they will show the present, for example, the presence of Black people in the Netherlands. After this year, we will remove these new labels and these white labels and make new labels that will combine both the old and the new text. And therefore, we can introduce this new narrative into the main building. And after the exhibition, new acquisitions like the kappa and the tronco, as I mentioned before, will be displayed in the permanent galleries. Through the years, this project became bigger and bigger. So I could have told you about so many more elements to this project. But hopefully you'll be able to come and visit the exhibition when the museum is allowed to open again. If not, we have made video tours for the website that show the 10 different stories and gives you an idea of the exhibition. And of course, there's also the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for that wonderful presentation. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Stephanie Archangel. Stephanie is also on the curatorial team of the Rijksmuseum's forthcoming slavery exhibition. In addition, she is co-creator and co-author of the recent exhibitions and catalogs, 80 Years War, also at the Rijksmuseum, and the Rembrandthuis Museum's Here, Black in Rembrandt's Time, which explored the perception of Black presence in the 17th century Western art. She's also a member of the Terminology Project, through which the Rijksmuseum is taking a critical look at the existing titles and descriptions of its collection. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, I would like to thank everyone from the organization to have invited me. I must say I'm really honored to take part in this panel. I'm going to talk to you about this exhibition, Black in Rembrandt's Time, that took place at the Rembrandt House. As Maria already prior told you, I'm also part of the Rijksmuseum. I work as a junior curator at the history department, And together with Maria, I also work on the slavery exhibition. Prior to working at the Rijksmuseum, I was working at the Rembrandt House. And it was during this period when I was working there that I came eye to eye with this painting at the Maurits House. This is also the painting that sparked the concept of the exhibition here, Black in Rembrandt's time. This is the two African men made by Rembrandt in 1661. And to me, when I first saw this painting, I thought it was strikingly lifelike. It looked extremely human. And it was a real portrayal of two African men, one very much proud, to the other seemingly glooming, while he is resting his face on the arms of the other sitter. They shared a real intimacy. It gave me a feeling of recognition, something, to be honest, I did not have prior to that. And I must say that that feeling really gave me comfort. But while I recognized the humanity of these two men, I also felt something missing in my appreciation of the painting. I wasn't able to interpret what I was seeing. Who were these men? Did they actually exist? And the two seemed very proud and self-assured. But I was a bit hesitant because when it comes to the depiction of people of color in that 17th century Western art, could I even use the word proud? Until then, I was mostly used to seeing what we call conventional depiction of Africans in the Dutch 17th century as submissive, in portrayals of an enslaved person. The most popular of them all is the one of a servant for the white elite, pushed all the way into the background. And I mean, since antiquity, painters have known that painting only reproduces someone's external part. So to portray someone's personality, social status, you needed to use props. And in that 17th century, pages become what we call, quote unquote, a prop. They were used as a commodity to stress the importance of the social standing of the sitter. To be honest, I had no idea it could be otherwise. So to be actually, in many times, the sitters did not even employ a Black servant in their household. The painters would just make them up and add them to this painting, just to stress their courtly life, the wealth and the nobility of these white European men or sitters, women. But there they were, two African men, individualized, front and center, looking extremely real. And I remember talking to David de Wit, senior curator at the Rembrandt House at the moment. These are actually my colleagues at the Rembrandt House, Hester Huytema and Epke Ronya, head of the collections of education, who helped work on the exhibition. But at that time, David said, I think you need to talk to Elmer Colvin. He's an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, and he has researched Africans in the work of Rembrandt. So he's your go-to person at the moment. So I called him, hoping he could help me put things into context, because I didn't quite know how to put these questions into writing. So he did. So the questions I asked him were, how should we understand Rembrandt's work in the context of the developing Dutch engagement in the transatlantic slave trade and the inherent racism of the 17th century Dutch society? how did images like this come about? And what was this painting? And was this painting unique? And he had a quick answer on the last question. He said Rembrandt's painting of these two Africans were not entirely unique, but came in like a special period in that 17th century, where artists between 1620 and 1660 clearly had an opportunity to study models to life. This contrast with the two other periods, this is a big contrast with two other periods. Recent studies of images of Africans in Dutch art show that before and after Rembrandt, quite different images dominated. So before Rembrandt, around the 1600s, Mannerist painters like Cornelis van Haarlem based their paintings of Africans entirely on imagination, or made up. After Rembrandt, around 1700, painters increasingly catered to the demand for the stereotypical caricatures of Black servants with a slave collar, and dehumanized them. For example, what we see here, making them into cannibals. So these sort of pictures would later evolve into, well, the infamous figure of the Black Pete that the Dutch, I am embarrassed to say, are still struggling to get rid of. So this conversation with Elmer and the emotion I experienced while seeing the two Africans was the starting point of the exhibition. But how do we translate this concept into an exhibition? And how do you even make visitors have that same emotional response? I'm going to be brutally honest and say that we absolutely started with a very art historical narrative, putting the artist Rembrandt, his pupils, at the center of the exhibition. We presented the concept to a think tank, which was consisted from experts of color. And it's a side note. In this exhibition, we received a generous amount of support and encouragement from people both in and outside of the field of art history, which really helped us shape the concept of the exhibition. And they were brutally honest to us and gave us the immediate response as a feedback stating that it was way too Western. So by using this art history as the structure of the exhibition, we, for them, made these objects, made these Black sitters into objects. So we needed to think of a new way in which we would present these works and move beyond what they told us was a white gaze. So we needed to think of a new way to structurize the exhibition. And it was in that same period that we contacted Mark Ponte. He's a historical researcher at the Stadsarchief, which is the city archives of Amsterdam, who was already researching the society of the 17th century. In his research, he finds 3 Africans living in Rembrandt's neighborhood, a total of about 80 people who lived near Rembrandt's house, who were actually his neighbors. Mark uncovered therefore social and family connections and sometimes even details about their lives. Most seem to have arrived in Amsterdam directly from Africa or via Dutch Brazil, not as enslaved people or servants, but as free men and women working on the Dutch ships that sailed the Atlantic. Some married with Dutch wives and got mixed-race children, although poor, some were illiterate and aware of the laws that prohibited slavery on Dutch soil. Mark did not only give the sitters lives, but also names. Even though we weren't able to identify the models, we did have the opportunity to use these archives to show their presence in Amsterdam in that period. So with the feedback from Mark and the feedback of our panel, we understood that the exhibition should not be about the depiction of Black people in the 17th century Western art, and realized that we should represent it in the presence of people of color in Amsterdam at that time. So we decided to make this the topic of a small but focused exhibition with a book who was designed by our designer and advisors, Raoul Belay and Brian Elstock. So coming back to the first question, how should we understand Rembrandt's work in the context of the developing Dutch engagement in the transatlantic slave trade and the inherent racism of the 17th century Dutch society? After 1660, the Dutch engagement with the slave trade becomes more permanent, and it reaches a high point, or what one may call rather a low point. Images of independent and proud Africans were gradually and slowly replaced by those to present them as uncivilized and unhumane. In an essay in the catalog, I argue that this process of dehumanization was employed to rationalize the slave trade, slavery, and colonialism. They had to find their reason. Also, we had an answer to the question, how did images like this come about? Throughout Rembrandt's life, he demonstrated and had the reputation for working after direct observation. He had a deep, penetrating, and continuous engagement with Africans in his art. These African models were part of the streets of Amsterdam, who he then modeled for him, and he used them and also reused them in other settings, for example, in the adoration of the eunuch. So we changed gradually our exhibition concept from an art historical narrative to a more social historical structure that you see here, to better understand what we were seeing and to help the visitors have a better grip on how to interpret what they were seeing. So Amsterdam at that point was the center of the world, and Black people was therefore part of the society. The world found its way to Amsterdam. But of course, historically, the Dutch were engaged in slavery. Between 1620 and 1660, the slavery did not yet reach that high point. So the image that we see in that period are different. And of course, artists were working from life. Even though these paintings were made by white European men, we tried to reclaim this period for the Black community by presenting a different image than the racist images that, well, actually still dominate our Western art till this day. So to use these negative images have no function in the present for us nor the future, other than to remind us of the past that we did not want to continue. And at the same time, the past has also provided us with images that have a positive function in these forgotten paintings, prints, and drawings that is what we wanted to uncover in this exhibition with all its complexities. And at the end, I think what was most important was that the visitors would also find their way to this painting and these paintings and recognize themselves and loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that really wonderful presentation. Our next speaker is Diva Zumaya. Diva received her PhD in 2018 from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And from 2014 to 2017, Diva served as an adjunct assistant curator at the Art, Design, and Architecture Museum, co-curating the Getty PST exhibition, Sacred Art in the Age of Contact, Chumash and Latin American Traditions in Santa Barbara. Now an assistant curator at LACMA, Diva is currently curating an exhibition that reconsiders the 17th century Dutch collector's cabinet, exploring the colonial, capitalist, and nationalist implications of these collections. Diva.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. I will share my screen here. Apologies for the little title line. I would like to begin my talk by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the ancestral and unceded land of the Gabrielino Tongva. The Los Angeles County Museum of Art acknowledges its residence on Gabrielino Tongva land and its service to the area that is now known as Los Angeles County, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva, Gabrielino Quiche, Fernandeño Tataviam, and Ventureño Chumash peoples. Los Angeles County has been and is home to many indigenous peoples whose ancestral lands are here and elsewhere. As an art museum and a collecting institution, LACMA recognizes the role we and similar institutions play in this continual displacement of indigenous peoples from their lands, the theft of cultural objects and ancestors from their native caretakers, and the erasure and marginalization of indigenous artists in the stories museums tell. We are committed to working to dismantle the ongoing effects of this colonial legacy, building networks of support with and for indigenous art communities and tribes, and being better stewards of the lands we occupy. This acknowledgement marks LACMA's commitment to interrogating our own position in the structural conditions of settler colonialism and how we can work to dismantle them. As such, this statement is a work in progress and will continue to evolve through this process. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that have brought us here together, and join us in a refusal to accept oppressive systems as they are.
Diva, I apologize. We're having some trouble seeing your slide. It's cut off.
Oh, sorry. Here we go. Oh my gosh.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, sorry. At least I got the land acknowledgement in there. Okay. Sorry, are you able to? Okay. How does it look, Sarah?
Looks great, thank you.
Okay, great. All right. Apologies for that. Okay. I would like to also express my thanks to the Center for Netherlandish Art, Harvard Art Museums, and Harvard University's Department of History of Art and Architecture for inviting me to this panel. It is especially an honor for me to speak alongside Maria Holtrop, Stephanie Archangel, and Latanya S. Autry, all of whose curatorial and organizing work I admire greatly. Today, I am speaking about the reinstallation of the permanent collection of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. I want to begin with a disclaimer that there is, of course, much I cannot yet share, and this is very much a work in progress. I will reflect first on some of the curatorial possibilities opened up by new pairings or groupings of objects, and at the end, I will turn to the implications of our reinstallation on our curatorial working practice. Please note that the members of the curatorial team at LACMA are varied in their approaches to their respective material, and I speak only for myself in this presentation. As assistant curator of European painting and sculpture at LACMA, I have been part of the curatorial team that is currently working on the reinstallation of our permanent collection in the David Geffen Galleries, opening in 2024. In the new galleries, designed by architect Peter Zumthor, art from the museum's 15 curatorial departments will be found on one horizontal floor in rotating installations. By bringing together all departments on one level in the galleries, art from around the world will share space with greater equity, as opposed to giving some departments large galleries and some little to no space. The possibility of rotation gives the curatorial team more freedom in the long term to experiment with installations and tell new narratives with our collection. While the installations in the new galleries have at times been described as thematic, there are many narrative-driven curatorial strategies with which one could possibly approach their organization for scholarly and historical purposes. I would like to create groupings that reveal colonial histories, as well as narratives around the transmission of artistic practices and intellectual ideas. While approaches focusing on style still hold an important place as one of these narratives, in my view, the way it has been used exclusively and often to the exclusion of historical context serves to promote the myth of art's neutrality and render important histories invisible. This theme of invisibility has recurred for me as I consider the reinstallation. How does the collection itself render some stories invisible? What kinds of visual culture haven't been collected or valued and accordingly are not part of the collection today? While gaps in the collection can limit the stories that we can tell, it can also be productive to draw attention to them and consider the histories behind absences. In my curatorial approach to the project, it has been important for me to start unpacking what it is that I would hope such a radical reinstallation will deconstruct in the bigger picture of our history. In other words, what does a traditional and colonial approach to historical European art within an encyclopedic museum look like? And what can the alternatives do? How do the traditions of displaying European art in museums replicate and disseminate the structures of settler colonialism? And how can we dismantle them? In a colonial model traditionally followed by the majority of American and European encyclopedic museums, European art has been installed to represent a monolithic, authoritative canon of famous male artists from major artistic centers, installed in the most prominent and centrally located gallery in the museum. Their organization and installation reflects a teleological progression towards innovation that aligns with the narratives constructed by the founders of the Western canon, from Vasari to Greenberg. It often features mostly paintings made for wealthy patrons that have been assigned values of rarity and quality by those determined to be the most esteemed experts in their field. It is important to note that in this colonial model, one could also leave the European galleries and traverse the museum to find stolen African and indigenous objects and ancestors that have yet to be repatriated. I refer here specifically to the vast quantity of materials stolen in colonial plunder or through colonial violence, from indigenous ancestors violently removed from their burial sites to the Benin bronzes. Museums' ongoing refusal to repatriate these materials perpetuates colonial violence and will undermine the efforts of workers to dismantle their colonial structures. The curatorial planning process for the Geffen Gallery so far has encouraged my colleagues and myself space to imagine how we can challenge these long-held traditions. In planning potential new installations, one goal that's always foregrounded in my mind is to decenter Europe, which has traditionally been given primacy of space, time, and curatorial care at the expense of all other geographical areas. While the building's design itself does some of this work by bringing all the departments together across one level, it is my and my colleagues' task to explore how the collection's display itself can further dismantle the colonial structures that underlie how European art has traditionally been presented. I will begin with a highlight from LACMA's European Painting and Sculpture department, Abraham van Beiren's 1667 Banquet Still Life, and pose a question. What does this painting have to do with slavery? Such a still life painting, often called a pronk still life, with its opulent presentation of glassware, porcelain, oysters, and the ever omnipresent lobster, celebrates the wealth, variety, and abundance of goods available to 17th century Dutch consumers. In Van Beiren's mimetic treatment of various luxury goods, the connection to slavery may not be obvious until we consider the kinds of labor and processes that are rendered invisible. For example, to what extent did Dutch viewers consider the journeys that these objects took to get to the imagined table? How did the practices of excessive accumulation, collection, and consumption visualized in this painting, normalize the resource extraction, economic exploitation, and enslaved labor that they required? How does an image representing Dutch wealth celebrate these practices of excessive consumption, which were facilitated by and themselves brought about the birth of capitalism? How has the way in which these images have historically been discussed reflect our relationships to wealth and excess, to capital, and to capitalism? For me, it's critical to treat the wealth of the era formerly known as the Dutch Golden Age with criticality, and to address the violent means by which it was so often acquired. Some may respond to my position by saying that we cannot assess the past with contemporary values. However, I would argue that colonialism cannot be historicized as a past event, as it is ongoing. And people of color who have been subject to its violence historically continue to live with its violence every day. Why do these objects in particular, such as the Chinese porcelain bowl, recur in so many still life paintings? What journey did this bowl take to get to Van Byron? How might porcelain bowls made for the European market differ from those made for Chinese markets? Tracing the lives of commodities in this way is one strategy by which we can situate the long-term ramifications of Dutch colonialism in a broader Atlantic colonial landscape. This pairing of Willem Klaas Hede's tobacco still life from with a 19th century painting by American artist William Michael Harnett does not merely bring together representations of pipes and tobacco. Looking at these two images together raises questions around the long-term after effects of the surge in European tobacco consumption that began in the 17th century. How did the Dutch deploy enslaved labor and exploitation to maximize the profit of this colonial export? By Harnett's time, how had tobacco's affordability and accessibility shifted? Whose enslaved labor produced Hede's tobacco and Harnett's, and for whose profit? In Harnett's painting, we can see that specific brands of tobacco have now emerged. How is tobacco imaged as a commodity? In looking at tobacco branding, I will briefly turn to an 18th century Delftware tobacco jar on which two generalized stereotypes of Native Americans are represented, smoking pipes. In the case of this object, we can question how such generalized representations of Indigenous Americans circulated and constructed an image of an exotic other, and by contrast, constructed the idea of Europe and of Europeans. How and why did Europeans deploy this image of a generalized Indigenous American in the marketing of tobacco? This example in particular highlights the ongoing nature of colonial imaging as we continue to see this racist stereotypes of Indigenous people used in branding. Particularly when considering Dutch history, the example of sugar is an important one to address. Mrs. Frances Pigott was the wife of John Pigott, the collector of customs and a member of the Assembly in British occupied Bermuda. In the portrait, the location where she and her husband have wrought their wealth is alluded to by the palm tree behind her. How did this kind of portrait craft a specific type of civilized image for the Pigotts, in sharp contrast with the horrors of colonialism in the Caribbean from which they profited? How can we trace British colonial wealth back to the Dutch colony in Brazil, when slavery and sugar production were first escalated in scale in the Americas? How do luxury goods, such as this American silver sugar bowl, belie the increase in the consumption of sugar and tea, which in turn continually expanded the scope of slavery? Just as the silk-clad figure of Frances Pigott performs sophistication while eliding the inhumanity that afforded her such a social position, Frans Post renders the landscape of Dutch Brazil as an idealized pastoral scene. Having traveled to Brazil with Johan Moritz in the settler colonial project of the Dutch West India Company, Post's sketches and later paintings contributed to the humanist and scientific facade of an enterprise that ultimately fueled the Atlantic slave trade. This example shows how the curatorial marshaling of absence can at times be essential. What the image renders invisible from view is just as interesting as what it chooses to show. Further exploring the degree to which the United States has framed itself as the heir to European traditions can also get at the fraught connotations of European styles and historical narratives across the Atlantic and beyond. How has European history been deployed and to what ends? In bringing together Augustine Préjug's Psyche Abandoned and this British porcelain of Hiram Powers, the Greek slave, We could consider the transmission of classicism and its associated ideologies of the objective, the ideal, and the rational across the Atlantic to the United States. As art historian Charmaine Nelson has noted, in Power's famous and often copied Greek slave, the sculptor represents a Greek Christian slave as the vulnerable victim of unseen Turkish enslavers, allowing slavery to resonate with audiences in both the American North and South. In looking at how Powers decouples slavery from Blackness and from contemporary slavery in the United States, we can consider the ability of idealized classical forms to connote European and white identities. How were classical ideologies deployed in the neoclassical era in which Pajou was working, and how were they transmitted and revised for American audiences? Among other European revival styles, the classical is especially important to interrogate, as in our contemporary moment, the style has been weaponized in white supremacist rhetoric. How can we unpack the intertwined legacies of classicism and white supremacy? For example, what kinds of violence resulted and continue to result from ideas like that of the ideal body? One question that comes up often in rethinking installations of early modern European art is the extent to which the field should focus only on global narratives, or if a collection is not encyclopedic, or if it is limited to only European material, what new narratives could be drawn out in a reinstallation? The stories from European art history that museums have told so far ultimately represents an extremely narrow, limited fraction of its expansive scope. Which stories may have been less told or untold? How can revealing new narratives give visitors a more nuanced understanding of European history and its heterogeneous lived experiences? What assumptions about early modern Europe prevail, and how can we complicate them? In exploring these questions, we can begin to imagine how exhibitions and collection installations could reflect a fuller sense of each region's visual world. To this end, one approach is to complicate the traditional organization of European art by national schools. In my curatorial practice, it is important to resist the 19th century nationalist rhetoric of nations as glorious or exceptional that is often unduly imposed on the early modern period. One example of a pan-European historical theme is the era of the Reformation and Catholic Reform, in which a renewed emphasis on religious imagery, its utility in instruction, and its capacity to stir effective devotion was critical in European political events and the global spread of Catholicism via settler colonialism. In this pairing, Domenichino Zampieri's painting and Bolswert's engraving both speak to the importance of saints and their mystical visionary encounters with Christ in this era. At LACMA, many of my colleagues have already been exploring dynamic multimedia presentations in our galleries. These multimedia connections have included the relationships between paintings and print, as seen here, decorative arts, as well as costume and textiles. In this pairing, the iconography of the Dalmatic, which allegorizes the subordination of the Dutch Catholic community, speaks to Salomon de Bruy's painting of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, which he produced in the Catholic community of Rotterdam. Mixing media can also encompass the inclusion of more vernacular, domestic, and quotidian material, which can allow for the representation of more historical lived experiences in our galleries, not only that of the extremely wealthy. In this pairing, a hand-colored devotional woodcut can offer insight into intimate and personal religious experiences, while the image of mother and child on this Deruta Majolca bowl, taken from a Raphael print, speaks to the transmission of print imagery across visual culture. These strategies raise the question, how did images circulate, and who would have had access to what kinds of visual materials? How did artistic practices influence one another and move across geographical boundaries and types of media? How can we as curators interrogate our presumptions and biases around notions of value, beauty, and quality? What kinds of objects languish in museum storage because they aren't deemed to be of high enough quality? So much could be explored in European art history, including but not limited to female artists, gender, sexuality, sex work, people with disabilities, class inequity, poverty, and religious suppression. The 2020 exhibition we recently heard about at the Rembrandthuis, Black in Rembrandt's Time, curated by Stephanie Archangel and Elmer Kolfen, is an important example of how the traditional assumptions of early modern Europe's homogeneity must continually be complicated. In the reinstallation planning process at LACMA so far, it's been really exciting to see the multiplicity of voices contributing to the individual installations and to the broader layout of the building. Our planning meetings have ranged from 20 to 50 or so curatorial colleagues from across departments and across hierarchy, including fellows, curatorial administrators, curatorial assistants, assistant curators, and up. Smaller breakout groups have also formed to address specific galleries or topics. By no means have we, or likely any museum, completely mastered collaborative curatorial practice, and so many questions remain to be revisited and workshopped. How can we successfully expand collaboration and multivocality to other departments, education, visitor services, security, facilities, and more? Curators too often overlook the vast wealth of knowledge and insight about their collections that lie with security guards, art handlers, and others who have spent substantial time with the objects. Curatorial collaboration with educators, in particular, will be essential in shaping and presenting narratives in our galleries. The rethinking of the idea of expertise and the decentering of curatorial expertise is a crucial and ongoing process. It's also imperative that as we move towards more cross-departmental collaboration, that all contributors be credited and compensated for their labor. As we have worked together to co-curate the permanent collection reinstallation, we continue to work through questions of interpretation. How much, or how can we make historical narratives clear to visitors? How much can be accomplished visually and how much should be said in a wall label? How much interpretive material is the right amount and how can viewers access it? Museums continue to rethink online interpretive strategies and learning resources that can explode nuanced, complicated topics into greater detail than is possible in the galleries. One exceptional example of online supplementary material that I would like to point to is the Art Gallery of Ontario's deep dive into their fascinating 18th century portrait of a lady holding an orange blossom. In interviews with conservators and scholars across several disciplines, curators Adam Levine and Monique Johnson convey the multi-layered levels of meaning in this portrait. Critically reassessing the different ranges of visitor engagement with interpretation is a continually evolving issue that will require more investigation and data collection in the years to come. In thinking through answers to these questions, I want to personally allow for the greatest possible multiplicity of experiences for visitors. One visitor may want to walk through the galleries without reading anything, while another may want to read all the available interpretive material and seek additional information. Another visitor may come to take a selfie with our outdoor sculpture or come to a free outdoor concert. While the reinstallation is important, I want to pair this rethinking of the collection with a rethinking of the larger purposes museums should serve. While my colleagues and I will spend the next few years crafting historical narratives for the galleries, I personally don't see visitors' engagement with these narratives to be the only function of the museum, which should first and foremost act as a welcoming community space, open to different experiences and types of engagement. Issues of accessibility come into play when considering possible interpretive strategies. How can we make sure that all possible visitor needs are accommodated? How have museum displays and interpretation traditionally been conceived with assumptions about the bodies of their visitors? Different sensory and mobility needs that curators must consider in presenting their collections include, but are certainly not limited to, the availability of museum seating, quiet viewing hours, touch objects, and image descriptions. I want to conclude these remarks by noting that while it is very important to rethink permanent collection installations with one's colleagues, as we have been doing at LACMA, programming is only one part of the larger set of problems facing museums. That is, their implicitly colonial and hierarchical institutional structure still enables inequity, regardless of any efforts at curatorial collaboration. In all museums, the labor put into new and dynamic public-facing presentations is too often used as a cover that masks internal injustice. Any new approach to presenting the collection will be rendered futile if one's museum refuses to repatriate stolen objects, for example, or if its frontline workers are not paid a living wage. The work to dismantle the structural conditions of white supremacy and settler colonialism must continue both without and, most importantly, from within. Thank you.
Thank you, Diva, for that very thoughtful presentation. Our final speaker today is Latanya S. Autry. As a cultural organizer in the visual arts, Latanya Autry centers collective care in her liberatory curatorial praxis. She is co-creator of the Art of Black Descent, an interactive program that both promotes public discussion about the Black liberation struggle and engenders fighting anti-Blackness through the collective imagining of public art interventions. She co-produced Museums Are Not Neutral, an initiative that exposes the fallacies of the neutrality claim and calls for an equity-based transformation of museums. LaTanya also co-produced the Social Justice and Museums Resource List, a crowdsourced bibliography. Her latest project, the Black Liberation Center, is an experimental series of exhibitions, workshops, and programming that spotlights art and culture that envision and strategize paths towards the freedom of all Black people, and thus all people. LaTanya has also curated exhibitions and organized programs at MoCA Cleveland, Yale University Art Gallery, Art Space New Haven, and other institutions. Through her graduate studies at the University of Delaware, where she is completing her PhD in art history, LaTanya has developed expertise in the art of the United States, photography, and museums. Her dissertation, The Crossroads of Commemoration, Lynching Landscapes in America, which analyzes how individuals and communities memorialize lynching violence in the built environment, concentrates on the interplay of race, representation, memory, and public space. Over to you, LaTanya.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And yes, it's really wonderful to be with all of you today and to be part of this event with so many wonderful colleagues. I'm just really honored by this. I want to start by kind of, recognizing where I am. I'm the descendant of enslaved people, and I'm living on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee and the Erie people. This is in the area that is at the present known by settlers as Cleveland, Ohio. I'm not from Cleveland. I moved here about a couple of years ago, and not from Ohio at all, actually, but I have thought a lot about Ohio in some sense, and in particular thinking about the murder of Tamir Rice. And I didn't know Tamir Rice, but I have to say back in 2014, there were so many of these murders that we were seeing, and they were being shared on social media. And I remember that year as just being really shocking. And it was a time that I started thinking about what could I do through my work as a curator. At that time, I was working at Yale University Art Gallery in the photography department. And I kept thinking, I need to change up my curatorial work so it's doing something that's trying to change and trying to change the world in some kind of way, in whatever way I can through my work. So yeah, coming here to Cleveland, I didn't know at the time, but I ended up actually meeting Miss Samaria Rice. That's Tamir Rice's mother. And I've had the honor of actually being in conversation with her and collaborating with her on some activities. And so my presentation, I'm going to be doing is kind of like talking, okay? And I am going to start with her words. So in December, I invited Ms. Rice to participate in a teach-in that I coordinated called The Art of Collective Care and Responsibility. And it was all about kind of how we handle images of Black suffering and death. Often I feel like many people in museums, I would say curators, definitely also artists, many of us aren't thinking about like the ethics of how we handle these images, how we distribute them and share them. And yeah, so anyway, ended up talking with Miss Samaria Rice, and she participated in our teach-in, and these are some of the words that she shared at this event. She said, so, her son was 12 years old when he was murdered in 2014 by Cleveland police, by the way. And her son and her family, they've all been denied justice. She shared, the death of my son has changed my life. It has woke me up in the most horrific way. America has sold me a lie. I truly believed that I was an American citizen and that I was going to get justice for the assassination of my son. I did not want to allow America to tell lies to our Black and brown children, so that's why I created the Tamir Rice Afrocultural Center. So she shared those words in December, as I mentioned, and it was only really 1 week after she received official notice from the US Justice Department that they were closing the investigation on the police officer who murdered her son. And yeah, she's really been going through kind of the worst kind of pain that I think any of us can imagine. And I want to share that because I'm trying to do my work, and I'm trying to encourage more of us when we are working with images of, you know, of murder of individuals, that we should really be taking on this work with a sense of integrity and thinking about the individuals who were killed, and also about their families, their loved ones, and just our community. When we show these kind of images, or we feel like we have to, we should really be thinking about the harm that this work, those kind of images do. They are not just representations of something, they actually are also violent. Yeah, so I've been trying to develop a curatorial practice that's grounded in what many of us call collective care, thinking about the people who are kind of experiencing the violence firsthand, those who are the most vulnerable in our society, putting that kind of focus first, and not being like an afterthought and being like, well, we can't bother with you, we'll get to you at some point, maybe, because it's more important that we do this for the sake of whatever, art's sake or whatever. You know, I think sometimes people say it's because they want to, you know, teach the world. So we need to show these kind of certain images, and without thinking about the context, without thinking about who would be in the space, what kind of training we need to have. Yeah, all of that. So to me, all of that should really be kind of happening first and foremost. And I think of my curatorial work as kind of an abolitionist, decolonial praxis. And I really do want to try to change the world, like through what I'm doing. I want to contribute to movements towards actual social justice. And when I say actual social justice, I mean something that is a bit more beyond, I think a lot of times people in museums think it's about showing particular themes and that's it. I mean it to be what actual social justice is about, the redistribution of power and resources. That's what museums really need to face. So at that event back in December, when Ms. Rice was at our teach-in, she kind of opened up that event, and our keynote speaker was Christina Sharp. And I think probably many of you know Christina Sharp's work. One of her really important books, I mean, she's, you know, this wonderful thinker who's done quite a bit. One of her important books is called In the Wake on Blackness and Being. And she has written about and really thinks carefully about how images of, you know, she's a slavery studies scholar, so you probably know her, but she has written and thought very carefully about how Black life is shown, and how we think about it, and how some of us do the actual work of care for our communities. So let's see if I can move this forward. So yeah, so I want to start with talking about exhibition that I created, thinking with Christina Sharp's book. So my exhibition is called Imagine Otherwise. It recently opened here at MoCA Cleveland. And when I read Christina Sharp's book, I think it was a couple of years ago, the book came out in 2016. I came across it. I mean, I think I bought it actually in 2016, but I didn't read it yet. Unfortunately, you know, so many books to read. And here I am doing a dissertation on lynching violence. And someone told me, oh, well, if you haven't read that book, then you're not doing anything. You know, whatever you think your dissertation is on, you're not doing anything until you've read that book. So I finally read the book, and I realized that he's absolutely right. There's this passage in there that starts off with, one of them says, for Black academics to produce legible work in the academy often means adhering to research methods that are drafted into the service of a larger destructive force, thereby doing violence to our own capacities to read, think, and imagine otherwise. Yeah, when I came across that, I was like, whoa, that really connected with me. It felt like pretty much, in addition to my time as a student, as a graduate student, it felt like all of my time working in museums, I've worked in white museums, and that's what I call them because that's what they are. We call other things Black museums, you know, Asian museum, but we don't call these other places, these so-called mainstream museums in the US. They're not, they're white museums. So I've worked mainly in white museums. I've often been the only Black person, typically, I've been the only Black person and only person of color in meetings for years by myself, for years. And even here in Cleveland, when I was in New Haven, the same thing, these cities that are majority Black, majority Black and brown communities, and yet the curatorial staff is pretty much white, right? And the leadership of the institutions remains white as well. And I'm being trained in these kind of spaces that are training me to actually, in many ways, do things that disavow my own people. And so coming across this, you know, her work, how she thinks, I found her book to be kind of a love letter to Black people. And I knew I wanted to kind of try to create a show working with this book. So this passage actually is kind of what I have kept to be at the heart of Imagine Otherwise. And this is where she says, what happens when we proceed as if we know this anti-Blackness to be the ground on which we stand, the ground from which we attempt to speak, for instance, an I or a we who know, an I or a we who care. And yeah, I thought about that a lot. Okay, so that's really different than like my whole experience being trained in white museums and white graduate programs and so forth. It's like to start with going, yes, anti-Blackness is just, it's here. We're not going to try to pretend that it's not a thing or it happens only sometimes or whatever. We're going to actually acknowledge that that is the ground that we're walking on, and that some of us, you know, an I or a we, that some of us do this work where we know this and we actually care. We build up an ethical relationship, a sociality. So thinking with this, I thought, okay, who would be artists that I feel do this work? And she, you know, in her book, if you've read the book, you know, she talks about the wake and how she kind of sees how Black people are kind of caught up in this afterlife of slavery, and our lives are at increased, in a certain kind of increased status of vulnerability. And the work of caring for Black people, for Black communities, is what she calls wake work. And so it's this kind of, it's a navigational kind of process. It's not one of pretending that the violence doesn't exist, where we know it does. And we also acknowledge how Black people kind of move through these spaces and try to find ways to kind of continue living, and not just to live, but to love themselves and to love one another. And that is what I'm hoping to try to do through the show, is finding, you know, I found some artists that I felt do this work. Let's look at some of their stuff. Oh, and also let me, before I get to that, I have 4 fantastic artists that I'm working with, Shai Keith, Amber Ford, Antoine Washington, and Imani Dennison. And the show originally was gonna just be in Mocha, Cleveland. And the show's changed a lot, you know, because of COVID. Originally, I actually planned to have many more artists and people flying from, you know, across the country and all this. I ended up changing that plan. You know, that when I was originally coming up with the idea, it was pre-COVID. And then I was like, yeah, I can't do that. So I made the show have less artists and people kind of more in the area in general. 2 are Cleveland artists, Amber Ford and Antoine Washington. Shai Keith is based in Pittsburgh. And Imani is based in New York, and she produced a video, and we'll see some stills of that in a second. And she didn't have to come actually to Cleveland. So originally the show was gonna just be at MoCA Cleveland. I ended up deciding, I kind of took upon a challenge. As I, you know, mentioned, I'm often the only Black person in curatorial kind of spaces, and that was the case at MoCA Cleveland as well. I was the only Black person outside of front of house and administrative kind of role, and only person of color as well. And really went through a lot of racism actually at this institution. And I thought with community members, and I was talking to them about the problems I was having, and someone said, you know, that's a great show and I want you to have that show, but I keep wondering why we keep putting our best work in these places that don't care about us. And that, that really, I thought about it too. I thought, yeah, and I know the answer, right? Because these institutions have money. And a lot of times the Black institutions in town don't really have much of a budget. And that is the case in Cleveland. Cleveland is a majority Black city, but the Black arts organizations in town, the budgets are just tiny in comparison to a handful of white institutions that have multi-million-dollar budgets. So I thought about the Cleveland arts ecosystem, and I thought, okay, this isn't just about me finding representations, work that is doing this in some kind of way, this wake work that Christina Sharp is talking about. I need to, as a curator, also do the wake work. And so the challenges I've gone through in this white museum made me actually embody the work in a much deeper way. So the show, I ended up splitting it and making it happen across 3 spaces. So one is in Mocha, Cleveland, and then 2 other sites, which are Black cultural institutions. And that was a way for me to kind of force the institution to put some money, it's not nearly enough, but put some money into more into these Black cultural institutions here in town. So one is in Mocha, Cleveland, and it's Shai Keith's installation. He's kind of got a 2-part installation. It's called Still Waters Run Deep, Fall on Your Ways. Here, I'm just going to kind of run through these images. So this is what you'll see in the space, and it is really a magnificent experience. It's a lot of ways to kind of think about this. Shai Keith has kind of done this. It's got video, it's got audio. It's doing all kind of things with the water. He uses light in really fantastic ways. There is this spill that happens from the projection that does go onto the walls of these sails. This is really working with Sharp's work in very deep ways, thinking about the wake, the being caught up in the wake of a ship. And it's multiple things going on. You could think about the diaspora, catastrophe, you could think about rebirth, so many things. And we do have, actually, he did use one of the images you can see there, let me go back, is that the image of Renty, the enslaved man that was forced to be photographed by Louis Agassiz. And I do know that someone did write in the questions about Harvard's, the case about that, and that Harvard won that case where the family member is trying to get those daguerreotypes back. So anyway, hopefully we'll get to that in the questions and can talk about that whole situation. So yeah, this is one of Shai Keith's installations. It is very majestic. It's kind of orchestral in a way. And then this is another one. It's called Fall in Your Ways, and it kind of takes on that energy, but in a different way, in a minimalist way. And yes, so I'm going to move on because I know we don't have much time. So this is one of the other spaces called Third Space Action Lab in Glenville. This is near Mocha, Cleveland. And in this space, we have 2 artists, one Imani Dennison, who has this film, it's called No Mas, Irreversible Entanglements. It's a really beautiful video, and it's shot in South Africa. And it's really kind of, moving on towards the Afrofuturist kind of perspective of Black people, just kind of the constant reinvention and just kind of moving on to a whole other world, getting away from the anti-Blackness of this earth, this global anti-Blackness, and Black people moving on to another place. The video has this really beautiful kind of lyrical images and has this kind of retro but future rural and urban thing going on, and really interesting back and forth kind of juxtapositions. Also, Amber Ford is in this space. She has an installation called Strands, Tracks, and Naps. And here you can see it's a mural and with a set of photographs and monoprints and collage work, really beautiful images. She's really about the relationships of subjects that she builds with her subjects. It's about, kind of Black people's connections with one another. She knows all of these subjects. And it's also, you can see a real sense of control, how people really look at the camera and defy, you know, any kind of foolishness. I really love this work. And just Black invention. There's so many different styles, and the history stays with us. It's in our hair. And yeah. And then the other one is at over on the west side of Cleveland. It's at this new museum called the Museum of Creative Human Art. This is a museum that was started by Antoine Washington, one of the artists in the show. And so Antoine, he has a gallery that's actually above this bowling alley. And so they use the marquee outside to kind of put a sign up about the show. And some images here. He has an installation called "And About That Seat at the Table," you know, looking at that so-called proverbial seat at the table where people would have a position of power. But often for Black people, that is actually just kind of a farce. It's not really the case. And there's often a lot of tokenization that is happening in institutions. So this kind of comments on that. And he's got multiple pieces in this installation. He's got like kind of a 2-room space, and he has this multimedia installation going on, and painting, sculpture, just like a range of things. This space has this really wonderful vibe here. This is one of my favorite works in the space. And a couple of the paintings by Antoine. I think that these artists really do the work of expressing kind of the endless and fierceness of Black imagination in this kind of navigation process. I do think, I hope that this show helps the artists individually, and I hope that it helps the Cleveland art ecosystem by just kind of exposing some of the violence that's going on here. I mean, it's really ridiculous. It's very much a segregated city in very intense ways in terms of the arts, and a lot of other areas, other sectors as well. Black art spaces, there's just hardly any support for. And I really try to focus on that kind of thing in the essay that I'm still writing. The show is open, but I'm still writing an essay. But also the description says this. I did highlight Mocha Cleveland's anti-Blackness. The place has been around for over 50 years, and it never hired a Black person or any real person of color in their curatorial department in a majority Black city. To me, that is a consistent pattern of anti-Blackness. And I did put that in the description. I'm trying to do something that is, you know, definitely not what institutions like, but I'm hoping that this is work that helps for the future, that these are some seeds and can build with other work that people are doing. The Black Liberation Center is a project I started at Mocha Cleveland. I'm continuing to do this project. I hope that if you're interested, that you will go check out my website. And it's so far a series of exhibitions, series of programming, but we'll have exhibitions and things like that. My idea is that I'm just kind of moving on, and I'm trying to leave white museum spaces and doing this imagining otherwise, doing that myself, and continuing to try to do these partnerships. By doing the partnership with these Black institutions in town, it was a way to put, like I said, some money into those spaces. I think that could be a model for how more of us can be doing that through working through white institutions. It could be a start towards something called repair, if that is even possible. It's not really, but it could be a gesture towards that. And I'm hoping through the Black Liberation Center to continue to do partnerships here in Cleveland and also wherever else I end up moving. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Latanya, for that really thoughtful presentation. And I want to thank all of our speakers for their thought-provoking remarks. And we're now eager to open the floor to questions. And I invite everyone to continue submitting questions in the Q&A box, but we'll now bring all of our speakers back to start our conversation. So again, thank you all very much for these really moving and thoughtful presentations. So we've had quite a few questions as you all were speaking. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with one that has come up a few times, which has a lot to do with the reception of your work. How have audiences met these exhibitions? What is sort of the initial feedback that you're getting from your various publics? And you know, what publics were you really trying to reach? For anybody who wants to answer.
Well, if no one speaks, I will speak. Well, for us, we will have to see about that because we haven't opened yet. But I think that the process that we've gone through is that initially a lot of our traditional stakeholders, older white people, think about this history in terms of guilt, and they guilt and shame, and they always want to talk with us about guilt and shame. And we really try to take that history of slavery away from those two topics and make it more of just a part of history of the Netherlands that has created the Netherlands, that has influenced the Netherlands, both in the past as today. And that is not something that is only about guilt or shame, but is so much more rich than that. And I think slowly but surely that is catching on.
When it comes to the Rembrandt house, it was, to be honest, also a very small organization, which were quicker to use feedback and change things. But to be honest, when I started this exhibition, I really wanted to make it for people like me, Black people. And I made sure to just push that throughout the whole exhibition. And I think when we make an exhibition for children, it's very logical, but once you make an exhibition maybe for Black people, in the Netherlands, because we have different systems of how museums are funded, it kind of almost sounds like, I don't know. It was made for people of color. I didn't hesitate to make sure of that. Yeah.
And I'll jump in really quick. I think obviously my project I talked about today is not received yet by anyone. And so we're kind of thinking through that issue of what our publics need. And obviously I work at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So I'm always thinking, you know, Los Angeles first and foremost, even though we have a lot of other folks coming in. And I think a lot of times my material with early modern European material, it's assumed that, you know, it's kind of irrelevant or that, you know, folks of color aren't interested in it. And of course that's ridiculous. You know, they are, but also, you know, looking at something like colonialism, like I said, is directly about the present, and looking at issues of slavery, issues of colonialism is completely about the present. Another thing that came to mind is, you know, we have tons of like Catholic Baroque painting, right? And big Madonnas and whatnot. And, you know, I'm thinking about what's the relationship between those objects and Catholic Los Angeles, you know, Mexican folks and other kinds of Catholics, of course, in Los Angeles. So I think for me, what's really important to think about is the kind of direct line between historical material and, you know, the very much lived daily experiences of our publics.
I've often found that for the shows that I've been creating, sometimes like coworkers will be like, I can't understand your exhibition. It's just so complicated. I get that a lot. I'm like, how is it that hard? I can explain it in like 2 sentences. I mean, you should read the book like this show is. I do work with books a lot, you know, so I think that people go, oh yeah, some kind of academic thing. Or I haven't read that book and whatever, but I'm like, okay, you should read this book. It will hopefully, I think it will change your life. Make you a smarter and kinder person, hopefully. But if you don't read the book, I think you can understand the show just for through a few sentences. I mean, I don't see why it's not hard to understand that anti-Blackness is prevalent and that Black people find ways to live in this anti-Black world, and we still find ways to try to love ourselves and one another. That's, to me, not that complicated, but I have gotten that kind of response from white people in museums, actually. Coworkers, so complicated. I found that with the people who come to the exhibition, they get it right away. It's not even, they don't need a whole lot of interface usually. They just want to know more about the materials and ideas and stuff like that. And then they're kind of, oh, haven't read this person's work. I need to, you know, be interested in it, but it's not like it's completely foreign to them. But I have had pushback with other shows too, where people are like, in the museum, so complicated, I don't understand what you're talking about. And there's this attitude of like, that's way in the past. It's actually happening right now. In many ways, we live with the ongoingness of slavery. We live with colonialism right now. We're doing it right now through gentrification and so forth.
Your point is really interesting about, this is very much happening right now, right? We're not really in a post anything, right? We're living this, and all of you spoke about this to some extent. And I'm curious in one particular way, you've all sort of also mentioned the idea of bringing in contemporary art or contemporary artists to interpret these issues. So can you talk a little bit about your experience of working with contemporary art and artists to interpret history? And why you think that it has or maybe has not opened up narratives, especially if you're, for example, working with work that people think like, well, this is 300 years old. It really doesn't belong next to contemporary art. Why is this here?
In the exhibition at the Rembrandt House, we also used contemporary artists. I will be bluntly honest, it was also an idea of our designers because we are still looking at white men painting Black people. And that sense of self-representation was needed to counterbalance that, that gaze I talked about earlier. So we use contemporary artists to show that that there are artists of color painting, and they are painting themselves and self-representing themselves, and they know exactly who they are. So we try to use those two worlds into showing that there was a world where it was depicted, they were depicted, and now there is this, we are in the now, and we can do it ourselves.
I think it is quite frustrating to make an exhibition on this topic, because you always look at history through the lens of people that you're not interested in. I mean, I'm not necessarily interested in a colonial person's view on slavery. I want to know about the enslaved people and how they felt, but we don't have that perspective. And then to fill that gap, I mean, it's logical to, or it's a good idea to use contemporary art, but I also find it frustrating, because I would like to use historical objects, and it's still an interpretation from the now, or from someone that is not that person in that era. So I have mixed feelings.
Yeah, obviously my experience with contemporary artists is limited given my area of specialty, but it's definitely something, the juxtaposition of contemporary and historical material is something that my colleagues and I are absolutely exploring and kind of thinking about in the next few years, and how to deploy that, selectively, and, not constantly, but like very strategically in certain areas, because I think for me, it's a really good way of illustrating that direct line, about illustrating the idea, not the idea, the reality, right? That colonialism is ongoing, as Latanya just said, through gentrification, through all kinds of different means. And so it's a good way of visualizing when you have an artist who is a stakeholder in that history and is a real, has a personal living embodiment of that history. I think it's a good way to illustrate that direct line, and can be really, I think people are turned off by it visually sometimes, like a more traditional minded curator might be like, oh no, it's very jarring, but I think for me, the point it makes is really important.
And if I can add something else, is I really do like the ending of our exhibition, and to have the visitor use art as a way to express their emotions. I think that I'm super curious to find out how that will turn out, what that will make, and how the interaction is going to be, and if that, yeah, I can't wait to find out.
So thinking about also this, some of you have also referenced this idea of absences and erasures, right? Whether that's in considering audiences that should be centered in exhibitions, right? Trying to care for communities, or if it's just simply, I want to know about the journey of an enslaved person, but there isn't a letter, right? I can't find something. So our audience also had some questions about this. And so in some really practical sense, thinking, for example, Maria, about the Rijksmuseum exhibition, how did you go about finding information about these formerly enslaved peoples? How did you literally find these stories and figure out how to translate that into a show? And then more broadly for all of our panelists, how do you really see your work being driven by or trying to recover absences and erasures?
I'll jump in, I guess, and muse on the topic. Yeah, it's really hard because, I think a question that comes up a lot is like, well, what does an exhibition about absence look like, right? Like, even though I can talk about it and I can, theorize about it, it's something that you worry visitors won't click with. And again, I also really wanted to make sure to talk about a multiplicity of experiences, because even though I can try to put a narrative out there, if someone doesn't get it, like, that's okay. I'm not, there's many purposes the galleries can serve, but yeah, it's difficult. And I think that's why, we're exploring interpretation and how that can look in different ways, what can be online, where do those interpretive models live that can be, exploded and really uncover difficult topics. And, I also think the power of our 100-word labels is also something that is too often dismissed as like, oh, it's just 100 words, or we can only do so much. But I think you can do a lot. And I read a lot of labels that offended me, so I think you can do a lot of action in that label, and talking about something that's not there is pretty radical, considering we're all kind of trained to, say like the thing is yellow and, kind of point to specific things in the painting. So I think just even by a, small flipping of language around in a small space could do a lot. So.
I am interested in thinking with people like Saidiya Hartman, her work, like her book Lose Your Mother, Wayward Lives. I think these are just really wonderful kind of meditations for thinking about working with an archive that is, highly problematic and sparse and very violent, actually, like the materials that are in there. And her writing, and other people, but she's really on my mind. I started to look like, where's that book Wayward Lives on my desk? Her work is one of these things that kind of makes me possible to just kind of keep going, as well as like Christina Sharp, those kind of people that they find those pieces and then they kind of spend that time where they really study it and unravel it, and then they bring in all of these other pieces. So it's often you might have small bits, but I think it's about the care that we take with those kind of pieces. And I know like Saidiya Hartman talks about like speculative, like this kind of speculative work that she's doing through her studies. And I think so it requires us to think in a more imaginative and creative way than a lot of times art historians in particular have been trained in. Like my training wasn't like that. But through reading, in different areas and stuff, I'm like, oh, okay, there's like a whole narrative and discourse over here where people have been studying and doing this kind of very particular, careful work. So having studied a lot more like Black feminism on my own, that wasn't my academic training, but I started finding I was not having the, I'm working on a lynching commemoration. There aren't that many memorials, although there's thousands of people who have been murdered, but there's often hardly any kind of material evidence, so to say, of like, to remember them. But I started to focus on the emptiness and the erasure, starting to study that, thinking with people like what Michelle Rolfe-Trio's book, Silencing the Past, looking at how histories are removed. And that's the stuff to put the attention to, I think. And yeah, like Diva was saying, how we show that in a museum, it can be kind of tricky about finding the ways to do it. But I think, there's a lot of smart people in museums. I think they can use their brains a little more and come up with some interesting projects, and working with more people, working with activists, working with, like people like I talked about, like Miss Rice, who's doing all of this important activism work, doing more collaborations like that, and in addition to working with contemporary artists to expose these kind of these histories and erasures. I think we could be doing more of that.
I think it's extremely difficult because it's when it comes to absence, because it's depending on the exhibition that you are working on. For the Rembrandt house, it was difficult but fairly easy in the sense that we used archives to have proof of their existence by showing marriage archives or their baptisms, showing their signatures. And at the same time, for the slavery exhibition, these same archives became problematic because we have archival information of these people, but why were they kept? Are this the true voice of an enslaved person, or are we now seeing a white person writing down what an enslaved person is saying? So there's a lot of layering that archive in this exhibition already started to exist. So we really had to talk about and think about how to move beyond archive, and we've moved more towards oral history, which was an idea of Alika Smulders, the head of the department at the moment. And I remember when she was saying this that I think I almost rolled my eyes. Thinking back, I'm a bit annoyed with myself, but I thought, how do you even want to do this? We are in a museum, we have objects, what are you doing? And at the end of this process, I can't think of how we would have not done that. We've raised oral history to be seen and interpreted as archives, which our written archives are, oral history is as well. So we now have an audio tour, and everyone shoot and has to put one on, which is something, again, it's like, oh no, you can't do that to an exhibition, but we had to use that because otherwise you will miss information that are from the enslaved people themselves.
Yeah, I think Stephanie said it really well. If I can just add something, it was also, so in this exhibition, we had to deal with the absence of voices. We had to deal with so we had to throw away all our knowledge of what an exhibition is and what a museum is and what an object is and what a visitor is, and start from scratch. And all our own ideas, our own instincts, they shouldn't work. So we had to talk and talk again and ask each other questions and keep each other on our toes to make sure that we're not going into the same path that we have gone before, just because there's a lack, or just because we didn't know better, or just because whatever. And that was extremely tiring because there's nothing that you can lean on. But it was also extremely fruitful, I think, just to to put everything that you think you know in perspective and like turn it around. And I think that the design of Afina de Jong, I hope that the visitor understands that she understood what our process has been, and she really tried to make that same movement of shifting and seeing and unseeing, and yeah. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, this is great. And as you all are speaking, it brings me to another question that was in the chat, which is about the issue of repatriation. I know, Latan, you mentioned maybe you want to discuss this a little bit, which is, on the one hand, actively tried to overcome erasures by expanding the kinds of resources and voices that we're going to include in art museums and in the archive. And on the other hand, maybe we've got some sources that were looted or should not be in a collection, right, for any variety of reasons. But it's like, well, this is the evidence we have, though, right? So how do you think museums ought to think about repatriation? What do you feel is the connection between a just museum and repatriation, especially if museums are saying, well, but this one thing seems to be doing a lot of work for us?
Yeah, I don't know how that works in the United States, but for us, I think it starts with research and understanding where our objects come from and our collection come from, and understanding what types of looting there is. It's not just only looting, but perhaps also gifting, etc. So there's all these gray areas, and then we have the problem, specifically in the Rijksmuseum, that the collection is not ours. It's owned by the state. So there's this whole new system that we as curators or as museum people only can advise on after we've done the research. So I don't know how that counts for the states, but that's our own specific issue.
Yeah, I think just personally, I think there can be a just quote unquote museum if there's not an active repatriation program. And as Maria said, it takes a long time sometimes to do the research. But there's also cases where, it's really blatant, especially in the United States, we have actual indigenous ancestors, like human remains in museums. And that's like a really appalling form of violence that's just blatant. And is not related to any, they're not going to display them. It's not related to any kind of didactic purpose the object could have. It's completely separate from that. So, and tons of institutions have them and are just not giving them back. And the communities, indigenous communities know they're there. So there's times like that where, it's just blatantly white supremacy and colonialism in action that they're not. So it's really appalling. And like I said, internally, museums have their own structures and processes, but there should be at least a process in place, towards moving towards that.
I've seen people, more museums start using words talking about they're interested in decolonizing and things like that, but I don't think I've seen too many places really do the work of decolonizing. I feel like museums can, but they probably wouldn't end up being the same thing. So if you end up being the same, it's like a process of actions to go through to do it in an authentic way, but you would not end up with the same thing. So I think what's happening in general is a lot of piecemeal or like these gestures or just use of co-opting of language and so forth, and then not really embodying that work in any kind of deep, real way, because they don't want to actually lose power. Like this idea of like, we're doing this great work and we're going to be the ones to show this to more people. We're doing the work of educating, so we can't give this back. I mean, that's just keeping that kind of colonialist project going, that attitude of we are the ones who are in power. We are the ones who have more knowledge than you. You're not able to do this. You're not able to make these decisions. That is just the ongoingness of like a white supremacy kind of project. And that is typical in institutions. So I think museums, there's a lot of work they can do towards decolonizing. And you would have to be okay with letting go of being maybe a museum. Maybe you just become something else.
Well, on those wise words, I am so sorry to say we have to wrap it up. There are so many more questions I wish we could have chatted about. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear from you all today. You all are doing incredibly important and inspirational work. And thank you. Thank you for being a part of this. And thank you to everybody who joined us for today's session. And we hope to see you next Friday, April 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for our next session, which is entitled Decentering, Recentering forging new museological and historical narratives. So until then, everybody take care.